Chapter 15 of A Diamond in the Rough by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15, in which the curtain falls on Jake Wyse. Fred King had made an attempt to intercept Wyse, but Jake had been too quick for him. Now it was out of reach, and the boy and girl were left on the little island to their own resources.
"What are we to do? He's taken the boat,"
asked Annie Marsh in dismay. Fred bit his lip with chagrin. Here they were, marooned, as it were, in the middle of the broad Susquehanna, at a somewhat unfrequented section of the river. How they were to get ashore, unless they signaled some passing craft, and boats were not numerous on the river that afternoon, was a poser. In the midst of these unpleasant reflections, he noticed that something was going wrong with the catboat.
"What the dickens is the matter with her?" he muttered. "It must be that Wyse can't handle her. Yet that doesn't appear to be the trouble. She seems to be settling in the water. And Jake, too, is acting like a lunatic. He has turned her shoreward. Good gracious!" he exclaimed a moment later. "She's sinking beyond a doubt."
That was a certain fact. The catboat lurched to port, then pitched her nose forward, like a duck taking a dive, and then disappeared beneath the surface of the river, carrying Jake Wyse down with her. She was weighed down by her ballast. Fred and Annie watched the distant bubbles and ever-increasing circles of the water with horrified surprise, but not a sign of man or boat appeared on the wavelets of the Susquehanna.
"I'm afraid he's gone," said Fred at last.
"Not but he deserved his fate, for if it had not been for your quickness and presence of mind, Annie, I'm sure he would have killed me with that knife."
"Don't talk about it, Fred. Please don't,"
begged the girl.
"I'll never get that scene out of my eyes as long as I live."
And she sat right down in the sand and began to cry.
"I don't know how I did it, but I couldn't let him murder you before my eyes. I couldn't.
At any rate, you saved my life, and I shall be grateful to you as long as I live," he said instinctively, putting his arm around her waist as he tried to comfort her. She let her head drop on his shoulder as she wept afresh. And then, well, he kissed her. He couldn't help it, could he? They sat there a long time, until in fact the lengthening shadows recalled Fred to a realization again of their unfortunate situation.
"I wonder how Jake Wyse got over here from the main shore," Fred asked himself. "He certainly didn't swim. Then he must have come in a rowboat, or perhaps a raft. Whatever it was, chances are he'd see her somewhere along the shore. I'm going to look. Come along, Annie, let's take a walk." "A walk?" she said in some surprise.
"Yes." Then he told her what he hoped to find. She went with him readily enough, for she was as anxious as he to discover some means by which they might be enabled to leave the island. And they were not disappointed. A small skiff lay tied to a stake on the other side of the island. There was a single pair of oars in it.
"Come on, Annie.
It's up to me to take you across. I'm afraid it will be after dark before I can deliver you safe and sound at the cottage." They embarked at once. Fred pulled off his coat and got down to work, and a pretty tough job he had before him, but he knuckled to it like he did to everything he took hold of, so that the matter simply resolved itself into a question of time.
"Oh, you truants!"
exclaimed Mrs. Marsh when the two young people walked into the cottage at 8:30 o'clock.
"You have been making an afternoon of it. Come now, sit up to the table and have your supper."
"Don't blame us until you've heard our story," protested Fred.
"Eat your supper first, and then you can talk afterward,"
laughed Mrs. Marsh.
"We'll do both at the same time, Mother,"
cried Annie with a little hysterical laugh which drew her mother's attention.
"I couldn't keep still if I was to die for it. Why, what happened to you? You talk as if you've met with some unpleasant adventure." "And so we did, Mother. I think, after all, Fred can tell you better than I."
And Fred, between bites, told the story of their remarkable experiences on the river. But he could give no explanation for the sinking of the catboat. That was a mystery to him. The report that Jake Wyse had escaped from the state prison only to meet a tragic end in the Susquehanna created considerable excitement in the mining village when the facts became generally known. When Moses realized that he had unwittingly caused his father's death, that the trap he had set for others proved a veritable boomerang, he had a momentary spasm of remorse. But it didn't last for long, for Moses never had any great love for his paternal parent. Mr. Wesley did not blame Fred for the loss of the boat. He took measures, however, to have her recovered. A diver and a derrick float were brought down from Wilkes-Barre, and the catboat lifted to the surface. Wyse's body was not found on board, but the astonishing fact was developed that 5 auger holes had been bored through the bottom of the boat's cabin. This explained why she had sunk. Who had done the deed or why it had been perpetrated was not so easily established. Fred, when he heard about it, recalled the sluggish movement of the catboat when they were nearing the little wooded island. "The cabin must have been nearly full of water at that time," he said to himself. "What a lucky thing it was that Annie saw those flowers and wanted to get some of them. I'd give something to find out who bored those holes." Then he remembered the trouble he had encountered in pushing the boat clear of the boathouse. At the first chance he went down to the place and carefully examined the basin in which the boat floated when housed. He discovered the cords, and pulling them out of the water found a wooden plug, weighted with a bit of old iron attached to each. "The fellow at the back of this job will land in the penitentiary some day," he said indignantly. "That is, if he's not hanged for murder beforehand." He showed the bits of evidence to the chief engineer, and Mr. Wesley didn't waste many words in expressing his opinion of the author of the villainous deed. He was so worked up over the matter that he sent to Wilkes-Barre for a detective, to whom he offered a handsome reward if he would discover the guilty party. Before anything developed, Mr. Wesley and Fred went off on a trip to survey a section of coal land some miles from the village. During this trip, Fred recalled what Annie had said that Saturday afternoon on the river about the possibility of there being coal on his clover farm, and he asked Mr. Wesley what he thought about it. "It would have to be prospected, probably to a depth of many feet here and there, before anything like a definite idea could be arrived at. You see, Fred, the great coal vein of the Black Diamond branches off a mile to the east of your ground. That fact, coupled with many experiments over the intervening ground, which have not been productive, rather upsets the theory that there might be coal on your property. Still, you can't always tell for certain. The best of us have missed a coal deposit by a narrow margin, and the discovery has been afterward made by accident. It would be a great thing for you if coal was found on your farm." "What would you do if you were me?" asked the boy eagerly. "I will consider the matter and advise you later on. It would cost you something to have the borings made under the direction of an experienced man, and in the end you might find the money had been wasted so far as results are concerned. I don't think you can afford to go into anything like that for some years to come. I have a fine little colt, for which I was offered $3,000, but I think he's worth $5,000, as he was sired by Theodolite, the former crack." Mr. Wesley shook his head. "Don't sell your colt, which is a valuable asset, simply to put the money into a wild goose chase." "I'm afraid you haven't much confidence in the presence of coal on my farm," said Fred in a disappointed tone. "I won't say yes or no to that, my boy. But I would advise you by no means to dispose of the property until you have made some investigation of its underground possibilities. You are young yet, and you have lots of time before you. If there is coal there, it won't run away. Stick to business as you're doing, and when you are in a position to make the necessary experiments, then it will be time enough for you to act." This was good advice, and Fred accepted it in the spirit in which it was given. End of chapter 15.